Hi there, welcome to my channel and to my first video, a briefish history of aviation. I'm glad you're here and I hope you enjoy. Thank you.
From the very beginning, man has struggled ever onward in his conquest of time and space. For countless centuries, lofty mountains mutely challenged him, standing as stalwart barriers across his path. Upon the oceans that surrounded him, he launched his ships. At the mercy of wind and tide, they made slow headway across the waters. Over the lowlands, the wilderness of desert and green valleys, he plodded his weary way, earthbound in the conquest of time and space. But man is no longer earthbound.
From the first dreams of men taking flight, such as Daedalus and Icarus, or King David's lament, "Oh that I had wings like a dove, for then I will fly away and be at rest," to Amelia Earhart and Howard Hughes, all the way to our present reality of high-powered jets and rocket ships, maybe even UFOs. Humanity's ambitions and subsequent endeavours into the sky is a story of dreamers, brilliant engineers that made those dreams reality, in no small amount of daring. Part 1. Pre-powered flight, dreaming, floating, and falling with style. To start at the beginning of our story, we need to go back over 11 centuries, 1,151 years to be exact, to a man named Abbas ibn Firnas, an Andalusi polymath, a man's first documented attempt at flight. 17th century historian Ahmad al-Makari wrote about Ibn Firnas as follows. Among the very curious experiments he made, one is his trying to fly. He covered himself in feathers for the purpose, attached a couple of wings to his body, and getting on an eminence, flung himself down into the air, when according to the testimony of several trustworthy writers who witnessed the performance, he flew a considerable distance, as if he had been a bird. And to one Elmer of Malmesbury, an 11th century monk who too dreamed of flight, a report states, in his early youth had hazarded a deed of remarkable boldness. He had by some means fastened wings to his hands and feet, so that mistaking fable for truth, he might fly like Daedalus, and collecting the breeze upon the summit of a tower, flew for more than a furlong, which is around 200 metres. Funnily enough, both men forgot to provide themselves with tails, resulting in an injured back and broken legs for Ibn Firnas and Alma of Malmesbury respectively. Now onwards, to the late 15th and early 16th centuries, to Milan and later Florence, Italy, where we find the great inventor Leonardo da Vinci working on his mechanical and flight sketches in his 12-volume Codex Atlanticus, in which he covered concept designs such as the omnithopter, glider and parachute. Da Vinci would later go to Florence, where he wrote Codex on the Flight of Birds, where he details his observations and examinations of the flight behaviours of birds and how those observations could translate to machine and thus human flight. Local tradition of the time states that Da Vinci had his assistant Tommaso Mussini pilot one of his gliders off Mont Ciceri near Florence around the beginning of the 16th century. As it goes, the pilot glided around 1 kilometre before landing and breaking his leg. Perhaps he too forgot his tail. Although historians think this is probably a mix of fact and tall tale due to the accounts coming from secondary sources and not Leonardo himself. He did, however, allude to attempting a flight from Mont Ciceri in his Codex on the Flight of Birds. He writes, "The great bird will take its first flight on the back of Mont Ciceri," suggesting he had plans or at least thoughts about testing his flying machines. Now to 1782, Avignon, southern France. The Montgolfier brothers, but more precisely Joseph Michel Montgolfier, iterating on his earlier 1775 parachute design, with which he reportedly jumped from his family house, began his first serious experiments in lighter-than-air balloon flight. Inspired by his observations of embers being lifted from a fire by some force which he at the time believed was a smoke and a special gas therein, which he named Montgolfier gas. Following that observation, Joseph constructed a small box-like chamber out of thin wood, covered it in cloth and lit some paper beneath the box, giving it lift, a fundamental principle of flight, along with weight, drag and thrust, forces which had yet to be mastered by mankind. Later, recruiting his younger brother Jacques Etienne Montgolfier into the endeavour, the two recreated the experiment at a 3 times larger scale, and using wood and hay as fuel, the balloon floated almost 3 kilometers away. In the summer of 1783, in the town of Annonay, southeastern France, the brothers' craft took flight in an unmanned public demonstration. It covered a reported 2 kilometers in flight, which lasted approximately 10 minutes and reached an estimated altitude of between 5,200 and 6,600 feet. Interestingly, the first beings to fly in the brothers' craft was a sheep, a rooster, and a duck, all of which survived. Around October 1783, Jacques Etienne became the first human to fly in a hot air balloon, making a tethered test flight in Faubourg-Saint-Antoine, France, and later that same day, a physicist named Pilatre de Rosier became the second. Only a month later, on the 21st of November 1783, the balloon was set free. Pilatre de Rosier, the second man to make the tethered test flight in the previous month, and a French army officer named François Laurent d'Alan, became the first humans to free fly in a hot air balloon, and thus they became the first aeronauts. Less than a month later, on the 1st of December 1783, at 1:45 p.m, Jacques-Alexandre César Charles, a French inventor and balloonist, and Nicolas Louis Robert, younger of the two Robert brothers, whom, along with his brother Eugène, were the first engineers to build a hydrogen balloon, would launch from Jardin des Tuileries in Paris in the first manned flight in a hydrogen balloon that would later come to be known as the Charlière balloons, as opposed to the Montgolfier hot air balloons. The pair travelled to around 1,800 feet and travelled a distance of 36 kilometres in a flight lasting just over 2 hours. It flew higher and for longer than the Montgolfier brothers' hot air balloon, demonstrating that choice of gas mattered just as much as the balloon itself. In the summer of 1784, just 7 months later, Elizabeth Thibault, born in Lyon, France, became the first woman to free fly in a hot air balloon. Despite the advancements in lift, there was still a problem, whose solution had eluded those that came previous, but it was about to be solved. Balloons had become good at rising and travelling, but they lacked a key aspect of flight: control. They were at the mercy of the wind. Enter Henri Giffard, French engineer and inventor of the world's first passenger-carrying airship, the Giffard dirigible. On September 1852, Henri launched from Paris in his dirigible, becoming the first person to make a controlled, powered flight in an aircraft, landing 17 miles away in Elancourt, thus proving powered airship could be steered and controlled. Towards the end of the century, Alberto Santos Dumont, a Brazilian inventor, sportsman and aeronaut, won the Paris Douche de la Meurthe prize, a cash prize of 100,000 francs, offered up by a petroleum businessman and avid patron of early aviation, Henri Douche de la Meurthe, to anyone who was capable of flying their machines from Parc St. Cloud to the Eiffel Tower and back in less than 30 minutes. For 50 years, if you wanted a controlled flight, you wanted a dirigible. Once engineers had figured out how to steer the airships, they scaled up, and the real skill came with the Zeppelin, the first true long-range airliners and bombers. A cigar-shaped structured balloon with a lightweight aluminium skeleton, allowing it to carry engines, cabins, and not surprisingly, bombs. Rigid, massive, and made for war. Brainchild of one Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin, a former cavalry general in the German Empire's army. While serving as an official observer with the Union Army during the US Civil War, Count Ferdinand would meet Thaddeus Sobieski Constantine Lowe, an American scientist, inventor, aeronaut, and father of military aerial reconnaissance, and would later go on to make tethered test flights at St. Paul, Minnesota, with former Army air balloonist John Steiner. Von Zeppelin, upon seeing the world from afar, had later said that this experience had sparked his interest in aeronautics, and after retiring from the Army in 1891, von Zeppelin would go on to devote his time and full attention to airships, ultimately bringing Zeppelins to the field of aviation and to the battlefield. While being responsible for inspiring some cool concepts such as the airship train and inspiring fantasy fictional crafts, by the end of the First World War the Zeppelin would ultimately change from wonder weapon to liability. They were slow, too big, and extremely vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire, and of course, to fighters. With the advent of heavier-than aircraft just around the corner, the Zeppelin faded into the past. The technology had come as far as it could, and after the tragic Hindenburg disaster in 1937, the public confidence in the Zeppelin summarily died, resigning von Zeppelin's namesake to niche roles such as advertising blimps. So steerable didn't necessarily mean practical just yet, and wouldn't for some time. The real leap needed something heavier than air. Across the Channel, to North Yorkshire, England, and to the village of Brompton, and a man named Sir George Cayley, known by some as the father of aerodynamics, designer of the first manned glider, and also the inventor of the wired wheel, which you may know better as the spokes wheels on a bicycle. Born 1773, Scarborough, Sir George Cayley was a pioneering aerodynamics experimentalist, who among designing and constructing various unpowered craft, outlined the four forces of flight, which broke new grounds and opened the way for later inventor aviators and our modern aviation era. In 1909, Wilbur Wright says, "About 100 years ago, an Englishman, Sir George Cayley, carried the science of flight to a point which it had never reached before, and which it scarcely reached again during the last century." Cayley defined the concepts of heavier-than-air flying craft with separate systems for lift, propulsion and control as early as 1799. Some reports, corroborated by illustrations in his school notebook, now held in the library of the Royal Aeronautical Society, suggest that he had notions of concepts such as the principle of a lift-generating inclined plane as early as 1792. Later in his 1809 paper on aerial navigation, Cayley would iterate upon these concepts, proposing an aircraft with a fixed wing configuration, which would later become the foundation of modern airplanes. He would clearly define the principles of heavier-than-air flight, distinguishing lift, the force acting perpendicular to the relative airflow, by identifying cambered or curved wings that produce more lift than flat surfaces, and drag, the force acting parallel to the relative airflow, resisting forward motion and arising from pressure differences, surface friction and flow separation, which he emphasised should be minimised. Separating the three functions of an aircraft, lifting surface, propulsion and control, by arguing that weight must be balanced by lift for sustained flight, that propulsion, the forward force needed to overcome drag, should be separate from the lifting surface, the wings, due to his earlier discovery of the importance of the dihedral angle for lateral stability in flight, meaning that the centre of gravity should be set lower than the flying surface for this reason, and that aircraft should utilise separate moving surfaces, tails and rudders, as a means of control, rather than relying on the pilot's shifting of their weight alone. Later going on to develop manned gliders, the biplane glider or first full-size glider in 1849, which was piloted by a 10-year-old for a distance of several yards. And 1853 saw the first adult manned flight by a man who is unidentified but is speculated to be either Cayley's coachman, John Appleby, or his grandson, George John Cayley, for a flight of approximately 274 metres across the Brompton Dale. That same glider now resides in the Yorkshire Air Museum. Sir George Cayley was instrumental in laying the scientific foundations of aviation, turning the proposition of human flight from imagination into an engineering problem to be studied, iterated upon, and ultimately solved by his successors. Our next pioneer takes us to the late 1900s, Germany. Karl Wilhelm Otto Lilienthal, born 23rd May 1848, also known as the Flying Man, and to some, as the father of aviation or the father of flight, not unlike our last subject, Sir George Cayley. Otto, perhaps building upon the knowledge set down by the aforementioned Sir Cayley, is widely recognised as the first person to make repeated, well-documented, successful, manned flights with gliders, of which he reportedly made over 2,000, all while meticulously tracking the data and making advancements by way of iterative learning or plain old trial and error, with each previous design informing the next, making heavy-than-air flight more practical than ever before. In 1901, Wilbur Wright writes, "Herr Otto Lilienthal seems to have been the first man who really comprehended that balancing was the first, instead of the last problems in connection with human flight." Nikolai Zhukovsky, scientist, mathematician and engineer, also renowned for his contribution to the fields of both aero and hydrodynamics, known himself as the father of Russian aviation, said of Lilienthal's flying machine that it was the most important invention in the aviation field. Over his lifetime, Otto Lilienthal made several key contributions to the science of flight. His methods of testing models and actual manned craft, comparing his observations of bird wings to that of airfoils to acquire insightful data about lift, drag, camber and curvature profiles of wings, all of which he documented in great detail. But perhaps Lilienthal's most tactile contribution was his normal Segelapparat, a repeatable manufacturable glider, which was developed by Otto and produced for sale and demonstration. In his 1889 book, Der Vogelflug, Lilienthal published his observations pertaining to bird flight, aerodynamic measurements, flight data, illustrations, designs, and his insights which become invaluable to the likes of the Wright brothers and to all those dream artificers to come afterwards. On the 10th of August, 1896, Otto Lilienthal died. He had set out the previous morning, the 9th of August, like any other, to fly his glider out in the hills. After 3 successful flights that same day, Otto would make his 4th and final flight. His glider had pitched upwards, believed to have stalled, and shifted promptly downwards, sending Air Otto and his flying machine 49 feet to the ground, breaking his neck. Ad infinitum et ultra, Air Otto. Despite his great accomplishments and contributions to the field, his lifetime total flight was only around 5 hours. Similarly to Sir George Cayley, without Otto Lilienthal, the advancements of our modern aviation era simply may have not come to fruition. Part 2. Powered flight. All to have wings as a dove, with an engine. Early 20th century, and 2 brothers, Wilbur and Orville, standing on the shoulders of giants, have just earned mankind their place among the clouds. The Wright brothers, building upon Cayley's ideas about a fixed-wing glider and from Lilienthal's practical demonstrations, solved the main problem that had been a block on man's ambitions to fly, the ability to control the craft. Precisely. They faced a 3-pronged issue: how to control the roll, the banking of the wings from left to right, or vice versa, pitch, making the nose of the plane go up or down, and yaw, rotating the plane around a vertical axis, essentially changing where the plane is pointing. The brothers would accomplish this by designing the 3-axis control system, a mechanism by which the wings could be twisted and warped using wires to control roll, a movable rear rudder which when coordinated with the wing warping would stop the plane from sliding sideways during a turn, and the front elevator, a separate movable front surface mounted on a canyard in front of the wings. The pilots could use a lever to control the pitch. This was moved to the rear of the craft in later designs, while wing flaps, hardly even conceptualised yet, wouldn't become common until the late 1920s and 30s. On Thursday, December 17th, 1903, at Kitty Hawk, Dare County, North Carolina, the brothers flew their machine, aptly named the Wright Flyer, with a 12-horsepower engine of their own making, becoming the inventors and pilots of the first machine in history to carry a person under its own power, while maintaining control and landing safely. The first airplane, and with that, begins the age of aviation. Giovanni Battista Gianni Caproni, who you may recognise as Count Caproni, made famous by the 2013 Hayao Miyazaki Studio Ghibli movie, The Wind Rises, which details the semi-factual early days of renowned Japanese airplane designer Jiro Horikoshi and his dream meetings with the Count Caproni, who laments about how he is made to produce machines of war by necessity, machines made to oppress and destroy, much like the in real life Caproni made military airplanes, bombers, transports, etc. for the First World War, but how he instead views airplanes as beautiful dreams thought to enable people to be free. Sadly, or perhaps even necessarily, as anything beautiful in this life can be spoiled, so too a beautiful dream, depending on man's inclination, can become a most terrible nightmare. Flight works, and we scaled it up for war. While the Wright brothers were busy making planes fly at all, Gianni Caproni was asking himself, how big can I make it? But he wasn't only asking to make room for weaponry, Gianni was also asking himself how he might make room for more people. Caproni made his name in the First World War. Italy needed heavy bombers, and as necessity demanded, Caproni delivered, bringing the CA-3 and later the CA-5 series aircraft to production. The massive 3-engine biplanes, boasting wingspans of over 70 feet, and with the ability to carry over 1,000 pounds in munitions that they were able to disperse over a range of around 450 kilometres and 500 to 600 kilometres for the 3 and 5 series respectively. Aircraft that could project power far beyond the front lines. And with that, war had become impersonal. Necessity is the mother of invention and innovation. Now that Caproni had brought the first heavy bombers to the battlefield, and with other countries following suit, necessity once again came knocking. To counter a relatively slow and clumsy heavy bomber, you need a machine that's quick and nimble. You need fighters. Up until this point, pilots had mostly been firing pistols at their enemies mid-flight, or even throwing rocks and tools. These recon planes were not fit to take on this new adversary. But that was about to change. April 1915 saw the first appearance of a machine built to bring down giants, the Eindecker monoplane. Designed by Dutch engineer Anthony Fokker, a single-engine aircraft with a key war innovation, the synchronization gear, the Fokker gun synchronizer, allowing the pilot to fire a front-mounted MG-08 Spandau machine gun, the first true fighter plane, and the practical end of Zeppelins. Though the world wouldn't see the first jet fighter until the summer of 1939, with the debut of the Heinkel HE-178 experimental aircraft, which quite unluckily for Giovanni Caproni, took flight the year before his own Caproni Camprini N1 experimental jet took flight. After the Great War had finished, Caproni could focus on his other ambition, passenger aircraft. He would take one of his earliest CA-42 series heavy bombers, strip the guns and convert its function and purpose, arriving at the CA-48 airliner, capable of seating up to 23 passengers with an enclosed cabin and passenger windows, and later bringing the Caproni CA-60 Transaero to fruition, which, as you can probably see, is just magnificent. The 9-winged, 8-engine airliner, or flying boat as it could also float on the surface of water, sported a wingspan of 100 feet and was capable of carrying 100 passengers as well as 8 crew. A beautiful dream indeed. Sadly, none of these craft really became mainstream, and the CA-60 after crashing in a test flight was destroyed spectacularly and was never rebuilt. But Caproni didn't stop, later found in the Aeroporto di Trento Motoreo, which is still in operation to this day. Caproni's specific vision of airliners may have not come true per se, but the idea that aircraft could carry passengers instead of just bombs, 40 years before the jet age even began, certainly did. So the next time you're on an airplane, and on your way to some sunny place, spare a thought for pioneers like the Wright brothers and Giovanni Battista Caproni, and how terrible nightmares, depending on man's inclination, may once again become beautiful dreams. Part 3. Golden Age. I'm leaving on a jet plane. 1925, and the US Airmail Act, also known as the Kelly Act, was signed into motion, switching flown mail handling from exclusively government-operated aircraft over to commercial airlines, ensuring a guaranteed stream of revenue, thus allowing them to invest in better airplanes, airports and passenger routes. In 1927, just 18 years after the first airplane was invented, Charles Augustus Lindbergh, an American aviator, author, son of a US congressman and former military officer, climbed aboard his custom-built, single-seat, single-engined aircraft, the Spirit of St. Louis, and took flight across the ocean. Launching from Long Island, New York on May 20th and arriving in Paris, France 23 hours and 5,800 kilometers later, completing the world's first solo, non-stop transatlantic flight and setting a new flight record for distance, beating the previous one by over 3,200 kilometers or almost 2,000 miles, earning himself a $25,000 reward, the Distinguished Flying Cross, a Medal of Honor, renown, being named Times Magazine's Man of 1927, among many other accolades and titles. But more importantly, demonstrating the idea that long-distance air travel between countries and even continents was more legitimate than ever before. The successful flight sparked a global interest in aviation. Civilians started taking flight training. Commercial air travel and delivery businesses began to take off. The phenomenon dubbed the Lindbergh boom saw the mainstream acceptance of the notion of flying overseas to holiday in distant lands, and sealed Charles Augustus Lindbergh's name in the minds of his contemporaries and the annals of aviation history. But the real people's favourite was a young woman from Kansas named Amelia Earhart. Born July 24, 1897, to parents Samuel Stanton Earhart and Amelia Amy Earhart, a woman with an adventurous spirit, dubbed Lady Lindy, due to her passing resemblance to Charles Augustus Lindbergh, oddly enough. Recounting an event from her early years, as an airplane from a nearby airshow made a sweep towards her and a friend, she said, "I did not understand at the time, but I believe that little red airplane said something to me as it swished by. She would go on to become the face of civilian aviation in the 1930s, and famously at 34 years old, the first woman to make a solo, non-stop transatlantic flight after already making the journey as commander of the crewed airplane, the Friendship. She was the 16th woman in the US to be granted a pilot's license, and she wrote numerous books detailing her adventures, in the process inspiring millions of new aviation supporters. On the morning of July 2nd, 1937, Earhart and navigator Fred Noonan would set about their 29,000-mile round-the-world trip. Taking off from Lae Airfield, Papua New Guinea, she would make a last transmission only 20 hours later. The two are believed to have crashed into the Pacific Ocean, somewhere near their intended destination of Howland Island, due to a potential number of factors, but primarily believed to have been a lack of fuel. Despite the tragic and controversial accident, humanity had now touched the skies, and the public's fervour would not be quelled. The next year, Howard Hughes, originally a film tycoon, and at the time one of, if not the, richest man on earth, creator of the H1 Racer, which broke the airspeed record at 352 miles per hour, would make his own successful around-the-world trip. Caproni had imagined the idea of large-scale passenger aircraft, but the materials weren't there yet to make it safe enough. For this, we needed aircraft constructed from metal, which was just over the horizon. Although the Junkers F-13 1919 was already the world's first all-metal passenger craft, it could only seat 4 passengers. Large-scale 50-plus passengers wasn't feasible until the 1940s, with airliners such as the Douglas DC-6, which could typically seat 60 to 70 passengers, and even later for jumbo jets that we're familiar with nowadays. With the Boeing 747 first rolled out in 1968 and taking its first of many flights in service of leisure and business in 1969. Seating 400 passengers. Unfortunately for those at the time, the 1940s wouldn't quite allow the level of passenger travel as we see today, but it would see an event that'd speed up the innovation and development of a technology that we would certainly go on to use. And that event would be World War. Part 4. Overpowered flight, the jet age and beyond. Gone are the simpler times of men launching themselves from hills and being contented to turn in circles, if there ever was a time when men were content. Now is the time of dragons. Necessity is the mother of invention and innovation. Ever since the first bombers and fighters had been introduced in the Great War, the speed at which aircraft were being developed had skyrocketed, and with the advent of the Second World War, the pursuit of martial superiority made jet-powered aircraft a necessity. Germany saw many innovations of the day. The jet-powered bomber, the Arado AR-234 Blitz, the first of its kind, could reach speeds of 461 miles per hour and had a range of almost 1,000 miles. The Messerschmitt Me-262, developed by German company Messerschmitt in 1942, was the first operational jet-powered fighter aircraft in history. Not the first jet, but the first to see sustained use in real-world combat scenarios. The fighter, which came in a fighter and fighter-bomber variant, would be one of only 2 jets to engage in air-to-air combat in the war, with the other being the Heinkel He-162, developed and fielded by the German Luftwaffe due to their emergency fighter program, which required Germany to quickly develop fighter jets in order to counter the Allies' bombing raids. With the Allies themselves only having the one operational jet fighter, the Gloucester Meteor, which sported 2 breakthrough Rolls-Royce turbojet engines with the capability to propel the craft towards 600 miles per hour, nearly reaching the speed of sound, and with a range of 600 miles. The pressures of the time saw men make monsters, and nobody was safe from their wrath. Thankfully, for all involved, these aircraft were late to the battlefield and thus didn't see much use during the Second World War, but the threat drove the evolution of the technology, which is still progressing to this day and allows our modern globe-spanning society to function at all. With our modern minds, it's difficult to imagine a reality without aviation. Not being able to hop on a flight to a distant paradise, if we're blessed enough of course, or the idea that we couldn't get our Amazon packages in a day, but it's easy to overlook the cultural significance of aviation. For example, I'm here talking about it and you're here watching it, right? Res ipsa loquitur, the thing speaks for itself. Take Miyazaki's works such as The Wind Rises, Laputa Castle in the Sky or Porco Rosso for example. The concept of steam-powered flying machines, setting mankind free and allowing them to reach for their best selves, the golden age of sailing across the clouds in search of distant lands, and for the pursuit of flight itself. Watching just the intro scenes of Laputa is enough to show how deeply Miyazaki was inspired or even moved by the concept of men flying. In fact, my own love for those particular pieces of media has served as my inspiration for this very video. Aviation has served as an inspiration for many others too, all the way from pilots to gamers, daredevil rebels and modern folk heroes like the Sky King, may he fly high, compelling humankind to take to the skies and to wonder where it may lead us. It opened our hearts and our minds, our imaginations, to some of our world's most impossibly beautiful visages and inspired us to create dream machines, making us the first generations in our long and storied human history to not only dream, but to be able to fly free with the avians, and yet still beyond. We've only been capable of true flight for 123 years as of the making of this video, and in that time we've come from rudimentary single-engine 12-horsepower aircraft, all the way to aircraft that are faster than sound itself, to craft that can touch the moon, modern dragons that can level cities, and airliners that can bring our hopes to reality. And now, it is up to man's inclination, whether it remains dream or nightmare. Per aspera ad caelum, daring men and women, Godspeed. Thank you. If you've made it this far, then thank you. This is the first video I've ever made and it probably shows. Regardless, I still hope you found it somewhat enjoyable and informative. Till next time. History of radiation. A brief history. A brief-ish.